Well, hi everyone, this is Dr. Shota with this week's video introduction to week number 5 of our course in the Principles of Nursing and Healthcare Research. And once again, very good week of discussion. This week we switched gears a little bit and we were looking at this Aiken study. This is the rather large study, rather wide scope study, looking at patient staffing ratios, or patient staffing rather, and patient outcomes and nurse burnout. Uh, this study was done several years ago in Pennsylvania. Primarily, a little bit of background of this study in particular. It was done primarily as a way to come up with justification or to get some baseline data for a lot of talk that was going on at the time about coming up with patient nurse ratios. This is a big deal in California about the time the study was going on. California, I believe, is still the only state that has actually passed a law requiring a certain number of nurses to patients. Currently, in acute care areas, it's with the few exceptions, it's 5 patients to 1 nurse. Um, and so this is a study that was really trying to get a good grasp on what was going on in the state of Pennsylvania as far as this goes. And so that's why several of you have pointed out that it's like there's just a lot going on in this study. They're looking at retention and they're looking at burnout and all this kind of this qualitative data that's burnout related, correlating it with all this data about patient care outcomes. There's a lot going on, and it really is a lot going on. There's a lot of participants in this study. Aiken and others used it used the state board rolls of all the nurses that were licensed as nurses in the state of Pennsylvania. He took half of them. It doesn't really say how he came up with that specific sample, but he took half of the nurses and then sent a questionnaire out. And about half of those that were contacted ended up responding. So that means a full 25% of all the nurses in the state of Pennsylvania responded to the survey. A few of you have pointed out that that seems like a low number, but actually that's a very high number for this type of a survey. The reviewing 50% or seeking the 50% of the nurses in the state, I'm sure that this is actually probably a high, or about as high a number as I thought that they were going to get back. So they had, I believe, it was a little over 10,000, between 10 and 11,000 responses back, which is a very high number and lends to a high significance level. The more people that you have in your study sample, the higher the significance, or the higher the confidence level that you're going to have for that particular study. For example, if I were to take 1,000 people and ask them to give feedback on some shared experience that they all have, if I have 1,000 of them and they all complete the questionnaire or all give me feedback, I've got 100% confidence level that that information is going to be accurate. Unless, of course, some of those people just didn't really want to fill it out and just kind of sort of, filled it out on paper and turned it in. And so, there it may not really be valid. But that's why we try to get as many people into a sample as possible, especially when we're talking about quantitative research. In quantitative research, it's all about numbers. The more people that you have participating, the higher your confidence level. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, 25% of the state participating, of all the nurses in the state, that's actually a very high percentage. If it was even lower, closer to 15%, likely the results would not be statistically that much different. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That the more, although the larger your population, the larger a percentage of that population you have, the closer that you're going to get to a true match in the data, and you're going to be able to eliminate the type 1 and type 2 errors, but you reach a point of diminishing returns. If Aiken had gone and had gotten every nurse in the state to participate in this study, it would have increased the confidence level even more, but not enough to make it realistic. And in other words, it just they got enough information back with the 25% of the respondents that they could come away with a pretty high confidence level that the results that they got were actually very accurate. The analogy might be, each of you took a multiple choice exam. There was 50 questions. Well, I could have had 250 questions too, and that 250 questions would have increased the confidence as to your ability to understand statistics. Of course, I think that all of you would probably rightly balk if we tried to do that, or if I tried to come in and add another 200 questions. It's like, what else is going to be gained? Really, not that much, realistically. So everything has to be balanced, and you try to find that sweet point, getting the number of people into the study that you need to that will bring you the best results or the highest confidence results. But doing so realistically and doing it in a realistic fashion. So that was really kind of the focus of this week. And going on to week 5, your first written assignment is due. It's your critique. You're going to be critiquing a quantitative study. I've posted some information about that, about what you need to do to keep in mind as you're doing that. Remember that it takes time. It is more time consuming than it at first may seem, because for each one of those criterion you're going to be assessing, you need to address them each pretty completely. In other words, it's not just a yes/no kind of a question or a yes/no kind of a answer in each of those boxes. You're going to be describing how each one of those criterion were evidenced, and a little bit of a description about them. So it does take a little bit of time. So I just want to warn you about that. Don't put it off to the last minute, because you're going to find yourself boxed in with a time issue. For the discussion this week, we're going to continue with the same Aiken study. We're going to be looking at this study again, and this time looking at the difference between a sample and a population, and generalizability. I posted a couple messages in class this week, thinking about how generalizable are these results. And so I'm going to leave it to the class to sort of start that discussion rather than start to give too much feedback on how generalizable the results really are here. I want you to chew on that a bit, digest it, and we'll kind of talk about it in the discussion questions. But that's kind of where we're at this week. We're at the halfway point, exactly halfway through class. For those of you that are off for this Memorial Day weekend, have a wonderful Memorial Day, the rest of it, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the discussion forums.